relationships are complex. So it's like rules never work. It's never like, here's your checklist, and if you just do this thing, you'll be fine. It's like you're in this dance with this other person, and you're both learning, and you're both growing, and you're both trying to figure stuff out, and you're both trying to become, better, more evolved, more nuanced versions of yourself. So where do people go wrong? Well,
Welcome back to the You Can Too podcast. On today's show, we have multiple best-selling author of the best coaching book in the past decade, really, and new author of How to Work with Almost Anyone. I am so excited to speak with you. As I said before this, I read The Coaching Habit almost 3 years ago when I first jumped into this space, and it was very impactful on me, not only in coaching, but in my life in general. So thank you so much for coming on the show. We have Michael Bungay. I want to start early on in your journey, though, because you became a crisis counselor as a teenager. I'm
yeah,
curious
that's right.
what kind of impact did that have on the direction of your life?
Well, what had sparked that moment was I had found myself as a kind of young guy being in kind of those typical teenage conversations, which are full of angst and what's the point, and do they love me, and are they a girlfriend or a boyfriend? And I'm like, honestly, I wasn't dating at the at the time, but I was listening to other people telling me the stories of them dating, and I was like, I'm obviously good at listening, but I have no idea if this is helpful or not. So, it was as much a quest to kind of go, how can I actually be helpful in this type of conversation? And so I did this training. They would call it Rogerian training after Carl Rogers. And it was the first time I realized that the power of asking a question and then shutting up and listening to the answer, and also asking a question and realizing that their first answer might not be their only answer or even their best answer. There were layers to get to. And the power and the presence of being genuinely curious, being genuinely kind of caring about that other person, and showing that care not by giving them advice and offering solutions and trying to fix it and trying to save them, but to give them the respect to say, I think you can figure this out. I am on your side. I am, the phrase I use now is I'm showing up with fierce love. Like, I'm 100% on your side, but I also want to do all I can to have you be the best version of yourself. And so, the good news is, even though I did the training, I didn't have too many kind of suicidal phone calls with other young people, but it really taught me the discipline of being quiet. Because I like being in the spotlight. I like doing a podcast because I'm like, look at me. Let me talk about me. And I like performing and I like teaching. And I've got all the cultural cards that allow me to do that because I'm a middle-aged, tall, overeducated, white, straight dude. So I've got all of that on my side. And the most significant learning around this was what it means to step off the spotlight, out of the spotlight, and allow the other person to be the center of the conversation.
Yeah, it seems like in most conversations we're not listening, but we're waiting for our turn to speak. Like that's how most conversations go, and it's crazy to think about that because as soon as I read your book, it's so simplistic, but it's often what we need, right? We often overcomplicate things, and I'm so excited to dive into the discrepancies
Yeah.
we can dive into when it comes to asking questions and how to ask the right questions. But you also in your early 20s became a Rhodes Scholar, and
Mm.
there was multiple different paths throughout your journey that I want to dive into that created the person that you are today. So what did that teach you about yourself?
Well, I guess there were kind of what it taught me about myself leading up to becoming a Rhodes Scholar, and then how it affected my life after I became a Rhodes Scholar. So um, the seed of becoming a Rhodes Scholar had actually been planted when I was 14, because a teacher at my school had said, "Well, Michael, what do you want to do when you grow up?" Which, by the way, worst question ever. I mean,
Yeah.
I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up. I mean, it's like a ridiculously hard question. Um, but anyway, I was like, I don't know. But I told him, I thought, look, I want to go to Oxford University. because my dad, who is English, went to Oxford University. He actually grew up in Oxford, and so he went to Oxford as a local kid. And so my teacher kind of rolled his eyes. It's like, what are you talking about? But said, well, you'll have to be a Rhodes Scholar to do that. And I'm like, okay, sure. I don't know what that means, but noted. But it definitely planted a seed, and by the time I was in my third year at university, I was like, I'm going to apply to be a Rhodes Scholar. And I went in and I was like, okay, so what's the process? And they're like, well, you apply and you need to write an application and get referees and stuff. Then everybody gets a first interview, and then we get it down to a short list and a final interview, and then we decide. I'm like, okay, great. So I put it all together. I submitted it, and I didn't even get an interview. And I was gutted, because the woman had literally said everybody gets an interview. And I was like, my application so bad that it failed the first hurdle, which everybody passes. So here's what that taught me was having that conversation with myself is like, do I want to go again? Like I failed at that. I got it wrong. And so I took a year off and kind of worked to not only kind of polish my application, but kind of align all the stuff I was doing. So in 2 years later, I applied. And again, there was a lesson here for me, because I got the first interview and I was excited by that. And I got on, so I'm on the short list. And I looked at the people who were also on the short list with me, like 10 people. And I'm like, these are all very impressive people. I mean, they're really smart. They're smarter than I am. They just felt more accomplished than me. So I was like, I can't compete on the field that they're all competing on, which is like, how brilliant are you and how smart are you? I need to be different. So everybody showed up. There's these 10 young people, and 9 of them are wearing blue suits and white shirts and a red tie, or a blue power suit and pearls, if you're a woman, a white blouse. And I was wearing a kind of purple suit with a pink tie, and I had long blonde hair, and I had earrings. And I was like, look, I'm either going to come a distant last, or they might bet on the odd person out. So kind of the lesson there was, bet on your strengths and bet on your difference. Because it's hard to compete on the same path as everybody else. But if you've got a sense of who you are and what your voice is and how you want to show up in the world, kind of figuring out how to amplify that is a really powerful thing. And so I won the Rhodes Scholarship, which was amazing and lucky because the first question in the interview, they were like, Michael, you've done an arts degree in literature, you've done a law degree, and now to Oxford you're trying to do a political degree, in politics. What's wrong with you? Can't you make up your mind? It was like a pretty savage opening question. And I was like, I was taken aback. I was like, well, yes and no. And that turned out to be an accidental joke. Can't you make up your mind? Well, maybe I can, maybe I can't. Everybody laughed. I was smart enough to realize I had accidentally made a joke, so I laughed, and everybody relaxed, and I relaxed, and the rest of the interview went really well. And I think that was the moment that kind of tipped the balance for me. So that got me to Oxford. And the key thing that helped with is 2 things. One is, I guess the big overall lesson is, it is a really brilliant way to disrupt the path I thought I was on. Because I had a law degree. I was a pretty terrible law student. I mean, I literally finished law school being sued for defamation by one of my law professors. But I was like, I probably would have tried to become a lawyer, and I would have sucked as a lawyer, and I would have been miserable as a lawyer. So what this did is, it kind of, sometimes it's really helpful to disrupt the path ahead of you and get pulled out. So it saved me from becoming a lawyer. I actually met my wife there, so that was 31 years ago. That we kind of got connected as a couple. And after that, everything changed, right? And I'm onto a whole new path.
Yeah, and I'm so grateful that happened, because we wouldn't be speaking right now. The
No,
books wouldn't have came out, everything that you've created wouldn't have come into fruition. And it's so important because you've impacted so many people, and like that book had such a massive impact on me. And reading this
Right.
book, I think is so important as well, because a lot of people aren't that good with relationships. A lot of people, we want to give advice. A lot of people really don't know how to communicate well. So I want to know,
Right.
like, what do you feel as, especially being married for 31 years and being in this space for so long? Where do you feel most people go wrong when it comes to building genuine relationships?
Oh, well, that's probably like a 93-day long answer because
Or
I mean, the first thing is like relationships are hard because, that other person is messy and complicated and confusing and irrational and brilliant and extraordinary and unpredictable, and you're the same.
Mm,
So it's not like Legos where you're like, can I just figure out how to click these two things together? It's much more it's much more chaotic, or actually it's better to say much more complex than that. There's this model in the world that I find really helpful, and it's a way of describing three different types of systems. There's simple, there's complicated, and there's complex. So simple is like baking a cake. It's like a 5 ingredient, 5-step recipe. It's like add an egg, add some cake powder mix, add some water, put it in an oven for this temperature for this time. Pretty much every time you're going to get a cake out, if you followed the recipe. Complicated is a step up from that. Complicated is like, let's say, like running a podcast, or maybe even more complicated, launching a space shuttle or a rocket to the moon. It's like, what? We have to figure out spreadsheets, we have to figure out processes, we have to figure out systems. But if we do it all, like if you, James, go, look, I've found a good guest, I've sent an email, I've invited them, I've sent a reminder email, I've set up my Riverside link, I've got a good mic, my guest has a good mic, we've got good cameras, I've lit my neon sign behind me. You've got all this checklist, but if you tick that all off, you're going to get a half decent interview and a half decent. So that's great. Complex just doesn't follow checklists. Complex is like raising a kid, or the metaphor I like is watching one of those big clouds of starlings. They're called murmurations, where they kind of like, they make shapes, and you've got like thousands of birds flying around in the same space. And you're like, how are they doing that? But it's not like they have a to-do list taped onto their wing going, turn left, turn right, go ahead, whatever. They're managing off principles. There are only three principles that kind of allow a complex flock like a murmuration of starlings to work. One is fly towards the center. Second is fly as close to the other bird as possible. Thirdly is don't run into another bird. And what that means is those birds are constantly trying to balance those three principles because there's tension between them. And as their individual behavior shapes the flock's behavior. And relationships are complex. So it's like rules never work. It's never like, here's your checklist, and if you just do this thing, you'll be fine. It's like you're in this dance with this other person, and you're both learning, and you're both growing, and you're both trying to figure stuff out, and you're both trying to become, better, more evolved, more nuanced versions of yourself. So where do people go wrong? Well, okay, here are three sweeping generalizations. One is they don't keep doing their own work. They don't keep learning and growing about themselves. They don't keep asking, well, who am I? What do I want? And how do I soften the edges? And how do I become less triggered and less responsive? And how do I see the patterns that I keep falling into that are dysfunctional? So if you've got somebody who's doing their own work, that's going to help. Point number two, they stop seeing the other person. It, it's just so obvious to me, and it's taken me a long time to get to this obvious insight, which is like people are hungry to be seen and hungry to be heard. And so often in our relationships, whether those are intimate relationships or work relationships, we kind of just objectify the other person. We kind of put them into a box and we're like, yeah, I get you now. And that ability to keep showing up and seeing that other person is really powerful. And perhaps the third is we don't give people the benefit of the doubt. And that's maybe connected to the first two, but it's like, um, this isn't always possible, but if you can assume positive intent, that helps you helps you give the relationship the best chance of repair. And if a relationship can be repaired, it can last. Um, you know, there's a philosopher called Martin Buber, and I don't know his work that well, but I do know one of his kind of core models is there are two types of relationships: I-it relationships and I-thou relationships. And I-it relationships are when you're a bit kind of objectified, you kind of don't fully see the other person. I-thou relationships when you get to be yourself fully and they get to be themselves fully, and you get to be present to each other like that. And I-thou relationships are hard and rare, and they don't, and they're fleeting. They require work and nurturing and care. But if you can have more I-thou relationships in your life, you're a lucky person.
Yeah, I've heard you speak about that, and I think that that's a really big, it's an important perspective to take. I feel as though for the new book, the intention, if you could say it in a sentence, is how to be together rather than what to do together. Like that should be the first emphasis of
That's nice.
getting into any kind of relationship, right? Why do you feel that that is so prominent?
Well, actually, let me ask you. I just want to, because I'm curious to know, because like I'm a little older than you.
Mm.
What in terms of where you're at in your life, what have you learned that is most important about what it takes for a relationship to flourish?
I think allowing people to be seen and heard and
Mm,
actually understood. I find that most of the times, like I said in the beginning of this, um, we want to give advice immediately, and reading that book helped me. I was becoming a coach, and one of my mentors recommended it to me, and I thought it was just going to
great.
be applicable to coaching. And realization, it became the most impactful book I ever read on relationships and how to ask questions.
Fantastic.
and
Yeah,
and so it really changed my perspective on even how to have a conversation with someone, let alone how to build a relationship. You start with that.
yeah, that's great. It is remarkable how little people actually want your advice and opinions in general. They want to be, they want you to be present. They want you to go say, "Oh, that sounds hard," or "That sounds amazing." They want you to say, "How can I help?"
Mhm.
They want you to do something that is a gift to them in some way, but it's not that often people are like, what I want. I'm desperate for your opinion on this. And of course, there's a place for advice and solutions and ideas. It's less often than you might think.
Yeah, one of my first mentors told me that really what coaching is at its core is giving someone a safe place to be vulnerable, and then asking the questions to dive
Yeah,
deeper, right? And it's
yeah,
so true. I feel for a lot of people that are getting into coaching or just want to be better at kind of building those kind of relationships with people, they think it's all advice. And when people ask me
yeah.
how am I able to be a coach, and it's because I don't have the answers. I'm the one asking the questions, and
Exactly.
and it's so
Yeah,
important to take that perspective. I think when we focus on that kind of leverage, and you've said it as well, when you give advice to someone else, you're kind of putting yourself in a position of um uh like you're trying to put yourself over them of some sort. You make them
that's right.
feel
Yeah,
like you have the answers, which none of us do. And I think that's a really important thing to think about, and it really changed my perspective on giving advice for people too. I need to really take a step back before I even try to do that.
yeah. I learned that from a writer called Ed Shine. He just
Mm,
died recently, sadly. And Ed Shine, who wrote a series of books called Humble Inquiry and Humble Leadership and
mhm,
Humble, one other in the series, I can't remember. It's like when you give advice, you one up yourself to the person you're giving advice to. You lift your status and you lower their status because you're the smart person and they're not, and you have the answer and they don't. And there is still a place for giving advice. I mean that's kind of how civilization has worked, which is like knowledge has been passed down.
mhm,
But there's also a way to give advice that a little slower. When I talk in the coaching habit, I just say, look, my definition of coaching is, can you just stay curious a little bit longer, and can you rush to action and advice giving a little bit more slowly? So get to action and get to advice, but just slow it down.
Hmm.
Because so often actually they just figure the stuff out themselves. And to your point, James, and you said it beautifully, often coaching is a place for it's a space where people can be seen, feel safe, be able to think and figure some stuff out, fall to pieces occasionally, just be encouraged occasionally. It's actually less, so often it's less about, oh, I need to solve this problem. And you won't like me as a coach or respect me as a coach unless I've given you the right answer. It's more around, let me give you some space so you can figure this out. And I am by your side, willing to help as best I can.
Yeah, it's that external perspective that's so powerful, and I admire it so much because even for you, when you had someone come in as CEO, you had a 2 year transition period of working with a coach as well, and
Yeah.
being able to really humble yourself and recognize that you always are going to need an external perspective. There's never a point when you don't. I
Yeah.
see it as a cheat code. I find that if I can hire someone that's a few steps ahead or just has a little bit more insight than I do, well, I'm gonna shortcut my path to where I'd like to be a hell of a lot quicker. And I think
Yeah.
we have to let go of that. You say too that a lot of empowering others is being able to kind of take the power off yourself, take the spotlight off yourself. And I feel many
Mm.
people have a really tough time doing that. How have you had the courage to do that with your life?
Uh, part of it's having just having some moments where I've realized that the price that gets paid for me being in the spotlight is another person doesn't get to be in the spotlight. I mean, it was in my undergraduate days at university, and I'm in a kind of small tutorial, so it's like 10 of us with a tutor talking about something, and it was two guys and eight women, and I'm friends with all of these people still. But I just noticed that me and the other guy just were doing a lot of the talking. It was kind of like it was before the phrase mansplaining was around, but it was kind of pretty mansplainy. It's like, no, let us pontificate because we're the smartest people here, and we're enthusiastic and we really like what we're talking about. And there was just this moment where I'm like, man, for being 10% of the class, I am talking a lot more than 10%, and maybe there's a way that I'm sucking up oxygen that other people can have. I guess the second thing is um, reading books like Robert Greenleaf's book called Servant Leadership. This idea that at leadership is being in the service of other people was really helpful as a kind of a framing. But thirdly, it's also I've I've worked hard to and I also have some natural wiring for this, which is to go, I'm less dependent on external validation. Like I still like it. I mean, I still like it when like I just got an award at a thing called Thinkers 50, where it's like here's the coaching award, and it's the so-called Oscars of management, and I got I was like, turned out that was I was pretty excited to get that award. I mean, I was like beforehand, I'm like playing it cool because I'd been on the short list twice before and hadn't won it. I'm like, I don't, it's just an honor to be on the short list, which it is, and I don't really need to win it because my self-esteem doesn't go up or down a whole lot whether I win it or lose it. But I won it, and I'm like, that actually felt pretty great. So let's not pretend I've reached enlightenment or anything like that. But you know, when I sign off my emails, I have an automatic signature and it says, "You're awesome and you're doing great."
Mhm.
And um, I kind of stumbled on that because I was teaching a class and I just, people were working in pairs. And I got them to look at each other and say, "Hey, after they've done an exercise, you look at the other person and go, 'You're awesome and you're doing great.'" And it's really awkward the first time I get the group to do that. Everyone's like, "Oh, I don't want to." It's like weird. But by the third or the fourth time, that they're loving it because there's this kind of they're being seen and they're being heard and they're being encouraged. And I have a really foundational belief that I'm awesome and I'm doing great, even when all the external parameters are, it's like it's all going to hell in a handbasket because it's like I'm failing and they're noticing, and it's like I'm like, but I'm awesome and I'm doing great. So part of it, James, is I have a natural inclination, and I've continued to work on this sense of, I don't need to win the prize. I don't need to be in the spotlight to still know what the big, still understand what the bigger contribution of my work in my life is.
It's so important having the internal environment not affected by the external environment. And I'm
Right.
curious, was there a shift, or was it like a gradual process where you've become more secure within yourself?
It was a process for sure. I mean, I'm remembering, what I was like as a kid.
Mm,
I was pretty competitive, which meant I was pretty bad at losing. I
right there
was
with you.
like, I would, I I remember, I vaguely remember this, but the story gets told in my family. Like we're in the backyard in my house in Australia. My grandmother is over from England, so she's probably in her 60s. We're playing cricket, which to the North American
Mhm.
audience, it's kind of like a version of baseball, but slower and more boring. Um, but kind of backyard cricket's fun, it's competitive. And anyway, somebody's bowling, and I hit this great shot, it's like hard and low, and it's going to score runs. And my grandmother, who is the most competitive person I've ever met, she's 65 or something, and she throws herself horizontally and catches this amazing. I mean, it would make the highlight reels of the the baseball on ESPN or whatever. It was like an amazing catch, and I was like outraged. I threw the bat away, and I stormed off crying. And I think that change started probably with my dad, who was a good sportsman in his own right, but just was good at this whole Michael, this whole competitive stuff. Who you're competing against. What does success really look like? Um, and so uh, I think over time that it's become. I mean, in fact, I have another little desk over there where I do my writing, and I've got a quote from the poet Rilke there,
Mm,
and it's a reminder now. And it comes from a poem of his called "The Man Watching." It's all about wrestling with the angel.
yeah.
Um, and the line that I love so much is his goal is not to win, but to be deeply defeated by ever greater things. And I'm like, that's what I want. I don't want to find the safe place where I can just keep winning.
Mhm.
I want to be deeply defeated by ever greater things, because it's on taking on the hard stuff that I kind of unlock the next best version of who I am, where I continue to grow, where I continue to try and become the best version of who I want to be in the world. So that means not going after the trophies. That means stretching after the things that feel really important, and I don't even know how to do it.
This podcast is kindly brought to you by Magic Mind. Now, if you're anything like me, you love coffee, but you hate the jitters that it gives you in that 2 p.m. slump in the afternoon when you still have a lot of day left, but you're not able to be focused throughout that time. And this is why I love Magic Mind. I've been taking it with my morning coffee. It's a small productivity shot that I absolutely love. It's with matcha, which takes longer to release in your body. So instead of feeling slumped at 2 p.m., you actually have that intentional focus and it reduces stress. So I take it with my morning coffee. It helps me drink less coffee, but actually feel focused and not wired throughout the day, which is so impactful because if you're a podcaster or you're taking calls or you're just in general, you need to be focused and have that mental energy. It's been something that's really helpful for me. I've been using it for a few weeks and I guarantee that you will like it. So if you're anything like me and you want to feel focused but not wired, you can go to magicmind.com/youcan2 for 56% off. Yes, 56% off your first subscription. And for your first one-time payment, you can get 20% off, which is insane to say the least because they have a 100% money back guarantee with no questions asked. And instead of waiting 3 to 5 days for that money back, they'll refund you in 3 to 4 hours because they believe in it. And I believe in it so much. So that's magicmind.com/youcan2 for up to 56% off your first subscription. And if you already use Magic Mind, you can get a discount off your next subscription payment as well. So it's magicmind.com/youcan2. Try it for a few weeks, see if you like it. I bet you that you will, and you will feel a lot more intentional with your day instead of just so wired and really just exhausted by the end of the day. Back to the episode. I love it. I love it. I had that quote in itself as one of my notes that I wanted to touch on because I love that I heard you talk about it and I believe in it so much. I recently started jujitsu and it's humbling. It's very humbling, and I want it to be that way where
Right.
I'm doing things that I'm brand new and I'm learning. It's like learning a new language, and I'm put in a position where I need to get or I want to get better. And I feel that we find that when we're chasing things from a place of security in ourself already, that's the best place to
Right.
be, because when you get there, then there's nothing to chase, there's nothing to go after, then life gets boring. It's like that's why
Right.
retirement never really made sense to me, because what are you going to do? You're just going to sit around?
Right.
I'm not that way. I don't think I can just sit around and hang out. Um,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
I
I have a niece who is sorry, James.
no, you're good. Go ahead.
I was gonna say I have a niece. I have a niece who is, I guess, 19 or 20. So she's not even an adult yet. You know, it's
Mhm.
like people's brains don't fully form till they're 25 or something. So she's still learning about life and adulting. But at university, she's pretty much of a I only do the things where I can win.
Mm,
I'm like, oh, I really hope that changes for you, because what that leads to is a safe and boring life that only gets smaller. Um, Whereas I have another niece who's about the same age, and she's like just crazy mad adventure person. You know, she's in Mongolia at the moment
mhm.
doing shamanic rituals, and she's 20. I'm like, you are so much braver than I was at 20. So I've got these two young women who at the moment have a different orientation to what it means to live a brave life. And I'm really hoping one of them becomes a little braver and more willing to lose.
Yeah, I think it definitely takes a lot of courage, because I was a similar child like you, where losing was not in my vocabulary. I didn't like it. It didn't make me feel good. And I'm actually going to Costa Rica in the beginning of, or the end of January, I want to say, because I
Nice.
want to get out and explore things and get uncomfortable as well, because I feel that's the best place where you thrive. And I'm 22, so I'm just getting I'm 20 as well, not 22, but and I'm just getting
Yeah.
started as well. So learning from you is a pleasure and a privilege, to say the least.
Thanks.
Um,
So
there's
James, how did
good.
what shifted it for you? Like if you've seen this growth or a change in orientation to you, what were the moments where you're like, I'm going to put that aside and I'm going to embrace a more ambiguous way of showing up in the world?
I think part of it came down to realizing that there isn't a place to get to, but at least my definition of what the purpose of life would be is to enjoy the passage of time. And there's no
Right.
place I'm going to get to that I'm going to be content and be okay with. Like this, and I use this podcast as a great analogy for it. When I first started this podcast, I started in my car, solo episodes for like 100 episodes. But I knew I wanted to speak to people like you and Seth Godin and many other people that I'm truly inspired
Right.
by. And I've had the privilege to be able to do that. When I spoke with Seth Godin, for example, I thought when I got there, it was going to be everything that I was looking for. And then the next thing that I'm thinking about is, okay, when am I going to get to in-person interviews? And then there's just
Right.
always going to be another thing that I'm going to be striving towards.
Right.
And that inspires me, rather than thinking, I know that in 5 years from now, I'm going to be looking back on where I am right now and think, I wish I smelled the roses more. And so that's the kind of lens that I look through it
Yeah,
as.
it's really interesting. One of the things that I've noticed, because I'm 55, so I'm like 30 years older than you. One of the things that I've noticed at my age is understanding that just because I can do it doesn't mean I have to do it.
Yes.
Um, and uh, as you move through life, you just build competencies. It's just inevitable. You know, you just get better at stuff, and you go, "Oh, I can kind of do this stuff now." And I'm now got a bunch of experience in my past, so I've got just this range of different things I can turn my hand to, probably do an okay job at. So for me now, the challenge is going, well, of all the things I could do, what do I want to do? And in a different book, I talk about this goal of trying to find the balance between thrilling and important and daunting. Thrilling, meaning it kind of speaks to you and who you want to be and kind of your values or your kind of orientation to the world. Important, meaning that it's contributing to the world and kind of making the world a better place, because I want that to happen. And daunting, meaning it kind of takes you to the edge of who you are and what you want to be. And I think, whether you're 55 or whether you're 22, you can still be asking yourself, well, what's thrilling, important, and daunting for me? And as you wrestle with that answer, you learn about yourself and you also find an orientation as to what might be next for you.
Absolutely. I think the best place that you can be in is a place of just discomfort. I mean, there's no place that anyone's ever going to get to where you think that you're content in a place. And there's been a question I've been asking a lot recently to people that have been in, whether it's any space for decades ahead. And I'm curious, is there something that you spend a lot of time on that you think that me or my audience should just skip entirely?
Uh, well, I I guess I'd say a few. The first is be suspicious of old people giving you advice. So, take that as a caveat, which is like, okay, maybe this is so take what's helpful and ignore most of what I'm about to say. But I do think that an interesting life often ebbs and flows between content and restlessness. Um, and there's something great about staying restless. And you're like, what's next? And where's my edge? And how am I learning to grow? But there's also something wonderful to say, how do I be content in this moment? How do I enjoy this moment? How do I be here and present in this moment? And there's just a tension between those two states, and kind of knowing how to ebb and flow between them, I think is part of the dance, and kind of learning what that looks like for you can be really helpful. Um, and then something I've heard Gary Vaynerchuk talk about. I really like how he has, in the 15 years or so that I've been following him, he's moved from a kind of crush it, be the entrepreneur, scale, it's like go large, kind of a bit kind of bro tech vibe,
Yeah.
to kind of going, be kind, love people, relationships are everything. And one of the messages that I hear from him all the time is like, if you're in your 20s, you just don't have to figure it out. Like, I started my company, Box of Crayons, 20 years ago, but that was when I was 35. I finished university when I was 26. I spent 10 years, what felt like being an apprentice, just trying to learn about me and what work I actually like to do. And then it was only when I got fired from a job up here in Canada, I'm like, I think I have to start my own business now, because I'm like mostly unemployable. And even then, I'm like, the first 3 years or 4 years of Box of Crayons, I'm like, my only business plan was, can I find somebody with a wallet to pay me some money? Because I don't know anybody and I don't really know what I'm doing. So it wasn't until I was 40 that Box of Crayons found a focus and a kind of purpose and an opportunity to grow. And, The Coaching Habit, which is the big book, it sold 1 million and some copies, that came out 7 years ago. So when I was 48. So there's this, 48 is more than twice your age, James. And that was my big breakthrough moment. So you got time. So part of it is be ambitious, but hold it lightly. Be restless, but be content. And there are these kind of paradoxes and tensions about life that, and you realize that there's no kind of settling on a perfect formula around that. You're constantly teetering one way or the other and going, well, am I too content or am I too restless? Am I too bold or am I too safe? There's a way you can just kind of dance between the two poles.
Yeah, it's a similar. I didn't ask Seth that question, but a very similar perspective. He said that he wishes he was more patient early on in his journey instead of just shipping so much. The patience is a big thing, and I mean, I started this podcast, like I said, when I was 17. I'm 20 now, and I feel like I'm just getting started, but also feel like a veteran in some ways. And
Yeah,
so, taking that
yeah,
perspective in now is something that I think a lot of people need to take in, because just always pushing to go forward, you miss out on where you are. And I never want to be in that position. I lost a lot of family young,
right.
and that always gave me that perspective. Um, you talk about. I want to dive into the book a little bit here, because I think the
Sure.
relationships is so important. For a lot of people, when you're going into a conversation, we all have stories that we're telling ourselves, and two people. It's a big reason that a lot of relationships don't work out, is because they're telling themselves two different stories and they can't communicate well. What are some of the stories that
Right.
people tell themselves before having a conversation that holds people back from being vulnerable, having open conversations, and actually building great relationships?
Well, that's a really good question. I think broadly speaking, the story you're off. I mean, the How to Work with Almost Anyone is a book written primarily for people in working relationships. You're like,
Mhm.
I've got to work with this other person. How are we going to get along? How are we going to thrive? Because work happens really through other people. I mean, you've got your projects and you've got your plans and you've got the stuff you need to do, but it's very rare that you're just going solo on that and it doesn't involve other people's collaboration or input or support or sponsorship. So, work happens for other people. And also, when you get into organizational life, if you choose to work for a company, there's a saying, people join organizations, but they leave managers. So, you can be really happy about what the company's working on and what stuff you're working on. But if you have a manager who sucks, she will drive you out of the company eventually because she will break your spirit. So I'm like, how do you try and build that? Not so that every relationship has to be perfect, but every relationship is striving to be kind of the best possible version of that relationship. Every relationship has potential. So how do you have a conversation about how you work together before you work together? Like before you hit record, you and I had a conversation about how will we be on this podcast. I was like, let me tell you, James, what I love about a podcaster. This is and you're doing a brilliant job. And you probably would have done a brilliant job anyway. But me telling you, like, this is what I'm looking for as a guest, kind of gives you insight and permission to kind of be nosy, go wherever you want, do all of that sort of stuff. I would have said to you, look, a good podcaster for me is they follow their nose, they know a little bit about me, and you've done amazing research. So I really appreciate that in terms of like you've got really informed, nuanced questions that get me excited and bring out my best. So we had that small little conversation before we got into the work. But to your question, which is like, so what are the stories we tell each other? I think I'm not sure it's a story, but it's more an assumption, which is like, I probably know who you are. That's what I'm saying. I'm like, yeah, okay. I see James is like young dude, whatever. I've probably made up a whole bunch of stuff about you immediately. You've probably done the same with me. You're like, I've listened to a couple of his episodes. This is what he looks like. I've made some assumptions about who he is. And it's a very human thing just to project what's true about ourselves or what we think is important in the world onto that other person. So this kind of circles right all the way back to where you started the conversation, which is what does it mean to stay curious longer? And it's not just curious about asking a good question. It's like curious about the person in front of you to go, well, who are you? What do you care about? How do you work? What does it look like when you're at your best? What does it look like when you suck? How are you underwhelming? Because we all have those moments. And what that curiosity does is helps you write the stories together about who you are individually, but who you might be together.
Yeah, without preconceived notions, you go into it with the curiosity of this could be brand new, and most of the times it is brand new. It's unlike what you
Right.
thought it was going to be. And I realized that podcasting, coaching, whatever it may be, was such a good path for me because I was always a person asking 1,000 questions. And I think
Right.
when we're curious about things, we open up new possibilities. It's like you said earlier, you have shiny object syndrome because you're always curious about what else could happen. Like what else can I do? Because you've done so much
Right.
already. And there's 5
Right.
questions to a keystone conversation. Do you mind jumping
Yeah.
through those? And because I think they're so
No.
powerful.
Yeah. So in this book, the key idea is don't be passive about your working relationships. Be more active and see what you can do to shape the best possible relationship, a relationship that is safe and vital, meaning full of life and repairable. And the key tactic in the book is have a conversation about how you work together before you get into the work. And as James has said, there are kind of 5 questions that you can ask and answer as part of that. So the Amplify question is, what's your best? And it's a really good question to start because it's all about saying, when do you shine and when do you flow? You might have heard of that Czech psychologist. This is everybody mispronounces his name. This is how I
Yeah,
mispronounce it. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi.
yeah.
And he talks about the flow state, where you're like time speeds up and it slows down, and you're like stretched but not too much, and you're like, oh, that was amazing in that flow state. It's like, tell me about that. And I think it's a better question than what are you good at, or what are your values, or what are your strengths, because it actually gives me some context. This is what it looks like when I'm doing work that lights me up, that gets me in the flow state, that makes me shine. And if I hear that from you and you hear that from me, we're already off to a really great start going, right, it'd be good to have that in this working relationship when we're at our best. The second question is the steady question. So this is about kind of the mechanics of how you work. We all build these little habits, these little preferences. So the question is, well, what are your practices and preferences? So like if you and I, James, were like collaborating on something, we'd have this kind of conversation about, like when do you like to communicate, and do you use Slack or do you use text, or do I ring you up from my rotary phone and kind of go, hello? There's all sorts of ways that we could kind of have a conversation about what are the mechanics, even right down to really, really tactical stuff like my name. Like my name is Michael Bungay Stanier. I've got a double-barreled surname that doesn't have a hyphen. So it's really confusing for people. It's like, wow, what is your name and how do I say it? So I'm like, so Bungay Stanier is my surname. It's not Stanier, it's not Bungay, it's both of the words. And by the way, I want to be called Michael, not Mike. And you may do the same. You're like, so look, I'm James Bracken the fourth, but please don't mention the fourth because I'm kind of embarrassed about it, but I have to say it because there's 3 other James Brackens floating around that kind of confuse the situation. And actually, you don't like to be called James, you like to be called Jim or Jimmy or Bracco, or I don't know. So you can have these conversations about just even how we have that chat and how we work together. It's amazing how people getting small stuff wrong like that becomes a stone in your shoe and becomes an irritant. The third and the fourth question are related. And the key insight that they share is that patterns from your past repeat again in your future. So these are the good date and the bad date questions. So the good date is, what can we learn from past successful relationships? And the bad date question is, what can we learn from past frustrating relationships? And if you're sharing that information, my suggestion is when you're talking about the good relationships, tell the other person what the other person in that good relationship did. Not just what you did, because you'll tend to take too much of the credit. But it's like, what did they do that allowed you to feel like this is one of the best working relationships? And when you're talking about past frustrating relationships, share what your role was in creating this dysfunction and this kind of underwhelming experience, because it'll be tempting to blame the other person, but actually the juice is to say, this is how I screw up relationships. So I do this all the time with my teams. I'm like, let me tell you really specifically how I will screw this up. I'll be good for a while, and then I'll have this moment where I'm like, I'm a bit overwhelmed, so I'll start bottlenecking it, and you'll be too polite to nudge me about it, so I'll just go, they don't even care, and so I'll bottleneck a little bit longer. And so I'm like, so let me tell you how you manage me when I'm screwing this up, because guaranteed I will screw this up. And then the fifth and final question is the repair question. Really comes from the research from like Esther Perel and Terry Real and these kind of huge titans in the world of relationships that say the relationships that last and thrive are the ones that get repaired, because every relationship gets torn or goes off the rails a bit. The ones that get repaired are the ones that get to keep going. So that question is, how will we fix it when things go wrong?
I love all of them. I think they're all necessary. They're not
Yeah,
options, right? They're necessary when it comes to having any kind of relationship, especially looking back on the past so that you don't recreate it in the future. And the repair question is so important because that's how you're able to sustain relationships, which is the
yeah,
foundation of really everyone's life is being able to have relationships.
right.
It's so important, and a lot of people get to the end of their life regretting that they didn't spend enough time on relationships, and
Yep.
that's why this is so powerful.
Well, that said, it depends on the longevity and the depth of the relationship as to which of these questions you really need to ask. Like
Mm.
when you and I were setting this up, we didn't go through all 5 questions. We really just talked about the first question, what's your best? Kind of went. Or maybe you could talk about it the third question, what's been a good past relationship.
Mhm.
And we just talked about, like, let's turn up the volume on these two things about how we were going to work together. So I didn't really say, let me tell you about all the podcasts I've been on where the host sucked. I didn't really say, let me tell you about the podcast where I was just bad. We didn't talk about repair. We didn't really talk about practices and preferences.
Mhm.
So sometimes, all of this is to say, this conversation is helpful with your key working relationships. I think of key working relationships is this going to affect your happiness and your success? But then different relationships require a different level of depth. Shannon, who's, as you referenced, is the CEO of Box of Crayons, she and I have these questions and we come back to them regularly. You and I probably are not going to come back to these questions until our next interview together.
Yeah, yeah, very true. I admire the way that you ask questions so much. It makes me think deeper about how I want to ask questions, and you have so many nuances that really change the way someone can approach a question, right? Adding "for you" at the end
Yeah.
or adding "what else." Like there's so many nuances that I absolutely love as a coach myself and as a podcaster.
Thanks.
These give me so much context in my life. I'm curious, what are some other frames that you have that you use that help you ask better questions?
I think one of the ones that, James, you'll definitely have heard of, but just to kind of make sure other people hear it as well, is
Yeah.
just to really appreciate being quiet. You're like, so you ask a question, and then often there's a heartbeat or two while the other person tries to figure out their answer, particularly if they're what's labeled introverted. There's
Mhm.
introverted, extroverted. One way of understanding those two labels is extroverts just start talking, even though they don't know what they're about to say. And introverts like to kind of get it all together in their head before they then say it. In that model, I'm an extrovert. Like James will ask me a question, and I'll go, James, great question. I've got three things to say about that. And I don't even know what those three things are yet. I'm about to discover it. I'm as excited as anybody to learn what those are. Whereas an introvert will go, hey, oh, there's this, oh, there's this, oh, there's this. And so there'll be a little bit of a beat before they go, James, I've got three things to tell you. So asking a question and then being quiet. And then um, after they've answered it and they stop talking, just being quiet, just allowing that answer to land and to settle, and perhaps for them to say something more. I mean, you can say, "Well, that's great. What else?" But sometimes you don't even need to say that. Sometimes it's just you said it right in the middle of the interview, which is like coaching is often around creating that safe space, and often that's around being quiet but being present to them.
Yeah.
Um, I think the second thing, and this is well, let me add two tactics onto this. One is um, realizing that when they're talking, the best thing you can be doing is really listening to them. And what happens when you're often early on in your coaching career or as a manager, you're not really listening. You're in your own head trying to you're panicking because you're like, now what? Oh my God, I've got them talking. That's great. But now what do I ask them? Or what's the next thing? Or what's my idea? Or what's my solution? And actually just kind of being present to them, going, the thing I can do most for you is see you and hear you and be present to that. And I'll figure out what thing to say after you finish talking. That can be really powerful. And then I guess the third thing is, and again, it's all around the theme of shutting up, is um, some people, they just spend too much time introducing their question. They're like, I need to give you 3 paragraphs of explanation or warm up before I ask you the question. And actually, you often don't need to do that. You often need to say, right, got it. And respond to their answer. You don't have to go, oh, I hear you say this. You just go, right, I hear you. Got it. Wow, okay, sure, right. And you can just take a beat and you go, so, you know, what's the burden it's finally time to put down? What's the hard thing you're still wrestling with? What's the crossroads you're at? what's the lesson you keep having to learn? You don't need to say much. You're just giving, the more you say, the less weight your question has when you ask it. So it's like when you're writing a book. In the first draft, when you write a book, you write your opening chapter, and then you almost always just scrap it because your opening chapter is your warm up. You're trying to figure out what the whole thing is about. People don't actually need that. They just need to get into the meat.
Mm. I'm gonna ask a question with a little bit of context prior, even with you saying that, because
Sure, great.
I'm learning so much here that I love. There was a moment in my life when I stopped asking why is this happening to me, and I asked how is this happening for me. And the direction of my life
Right.
truly changed because I asked a different question, you're going to get a different answer. For
Yeah.
you, I know that you asked 2 questions at the end of the day and 3 questions to start the day. But I'm curious, is there a question that you constantly ask yourself that is just a non-negotiable for you?
Um, it's uh, so the question that I am finding most helpful at asking myself every day, because you're right, I journal most days, and um, before I was talking to you, I was up in my local coffee shop. I just went to the gym, then went to my local coffee shop, and I just answered my three morning questions. And the three morning questions I have for me at the moment are: what do I notice? In other words, what's going on in my head and in my heart and around me? What do I want? And what's the one thing today that I really need to get done that will make it a successful day? If I can only do one thing, what's that one thing? But the question that is proving to be most illuminating for me is, what do I want? It's one of the questions that's in the Coaching Habit book. I think it's the hardest question to answer most of the time. And I've kind of recently added that in and taken "what are you grateful for" out. And what are you grateful for is a great question. It keeps helping you connect to the good parts of your life. And there's all this research that says when you ask that question, you become more grateful and you become happier. But I'm finding um, what do you want is really helping me understand what I'm restless for and what I'm ambitious for. And every day I write something down and I'm like, oh, I'm starting to see the patterns. I'm starting to see what I'm really longing for. And that's proving to be really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's the most difficult question for most people to ask themselves. I often
It's
don't ask
hard.
I often don't ask what I'm grateful for. I just express what I'm grateful for. I'm usually full of
Correct.
gratitude to an extent that I can't contain it, and so I don't ask that question. But
Yeah.
what do you want is a question that it's just like what do you want to be when you grow up? There's so many things. How could you narrow it down to one thing?
Right.
I want to be 1,000 different things in one
Right.
sector, or and then two different things in a different sector. It's there's
Right.
never there's never a point where you get dead set on one thing.
The benefit of asking it on a daily basis is you start seeing what feels more ephemeral. Like yeah, I
Mm,
kind of want it today, but don't necessarily want it tomorrow. But what's the things that, I look back on my journal and I go, what's the things I keep saying that I want that I don't yet have?
yeah.
Right. So what am I going to do about that?
Yeah, absolutely. When so obviously as we spoke like that book The Coaching Habit is best-selling book of on coaching for a very long time.
Yeah.
What skill do you wish that you developed earlier?
Well, I I don't typically spend a lot of time wishing for stuff in the past,
Of
just
course.
because I'm like, I have such a excellent life here, doing work that I care about, that is making some people's lives better. I'm like, whatever happened in the past, thank you,
Mhm.
because of all the ups and the downs and the like. That's really helpful. Um, a discipline that I have now that I didn't really have when I was younger was um, being better at focusing and better at saying no. But I just also think that I probably needed to say, I probably needed to say yes to a whole bunch of stuff that was underwhelming so I could learn how to better say no to things. But maybe if I had to pick one thing, it might be um, nurture relationships better. I wish I had more people who were closer to me, and I just had a better ability to stay connected, stay caring, stay interested in people that I've met in my past. And I've just met a lot of people who I've flown through my life and out of my life. And I wish I had a few more connections there. So it might be to be the person who is active in caring for and looking after relationships.
Yeah, and thank you for that because I think I hate to look through the lens of regret, but more so for me and my audience to take in because I'm always trying to learn from those that are ahead. In asking or in the best possible relationship, building one, there's three most important pieces. There's the safety, there's the
Yeah.
it being vital, and then the repairability. In your experience, what do you feel people neglect or miss out on the most?
Well, when I've asked people that, and I teach them safe is like psychological safety, and vital is like psychological bravery, and you've got a tension between them, just like we were talking about tensions before.
Mhm.
And then repairable is being able to fix it when the cracks appear. And then I'll ask people of those three things, which do you feel you're strongest at? It's often about even between safe and vital. Sometimes safe is a little bit ahead,
Mhm.
but repair always comes in third place.
Mhm.
So the thing that people are typically least good at is knowing how to and being willing to repair relationships when they get dented. People go away and they feel hurt, or they get reactive, or they get angry, or they get sad, or they get withdrawn, rather than going, how do I build the bridge back? That doesn't mean keeling over or not having boundaries. It means, how do I build back a healthy relationship with that person who I care about, but they screwed up or I screwed up? How do we make that happen? So I think the repairability is the thing that's least developed in most people.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense as well. And I appreciate so much of the guidance that you've given throughout this entire podcast. But there's one last question I ask every guest. My question to you is, what belief are you currently unlearning?
It's a really good question.
Thank you.
There, what is it? I I I keep having to unlearn this. It's very annoying. And this is quite tactical, but this is just what's really present for me at the moment is um the quality of your work is not sufficient to to change the world.
Mm.
Ideas thrive through uh, networks and distribution, and the idea that if you build it, they will come is annoyingly but massively wrong.
Mhm.
And I keep knowing that, and I keep having to unlearn it because I keep getting drawn to creating content because I love creating content. I love writing books. I like doing podcasts. But actually, if my goal is to touch, the way I talk about my personal mission is to infect 1 billion people with the possibility virus.
Mhm.
For me to infect 1 billion people, I need to focus on how distribution works,
Mhm.
not on creating more content. And I keep having to learn that lesson.
Yeah, I think it's a tough thing to learn because I'm in that same place as well, where you, when you build something and you're so passionate about building things, you forget that you have to get it out to people. That's such a
Right.
massive step. But when you're so engulfed in doing, it's hard to really
Yeah.
open the blinders and actually look outside, which is a really
I
cool
mean,
perspective.
the worthy goal that my team and I have set for the next little while is to sell 10 million copies of my books over the next 10 years. Now, we've already sold 1.5 million copies of books, which
Yeah.
is already amazing. It's already about 1.499 million more copies than I ever thought I would sell. But setting that goal, 10 million copies over 10 years, I have no idea how to go about doing that. I feel quite intimidated by it, daunted by it. But it's clear it's about there might be other books, but it's really around how do I get it out into the world? How do I let that information flow? How do I get distribution? How do I think about that? And so it's interesting. We're just sitting at the moment going, where do we even start with that? But we're wrestling with what distribution means.
Yeah, it's a really important thing to think about. The possibility virus is so powerful. It's so much of what I want to do with people too is help people unlearn these beliefs that stop them from thinking bigger. Because if you weren't daunted
Yeah,
by your goal, well, it's not exciting enough.
yeah,
That's not going to actually lead you more towards it. So, Michael, thank you so much for your
yeah.
time. Of course, all of your links for your books and your website and all that will be in the show notes. But is there anywhere that you'd like to direct people?
Brilliant. If you're interested in any of this stuff, probably the hub is the website mbs.works. That's where you can get access to the books and all the kind of free resources that are part of the books and newsletters and social media. All of that stuff is findable at mbs.works.